At 4:30 a.m. on the 15th of June 1885, a kerosene lamp flickered to life in a small farmhouse near the town of Geneseo, Illinois. The flame cast long shadows across a wooden table. A man in his early 40s, Samuel Briggs, pulled on his boots, the leather still stiff from yesterday's fieldwork. He had been awake for 10 minutes already, lying still, listening to the wind. The rooster had not crowed yet, but he did not wait for it. Outside, a thin fog clung to the cornfields. The temperature was just above 60 degrees. There was no sound of machinery, no distant traffic, no electric hum. Only the creak of floorboards, the low of a cow, and the faint rustle of leaves. What happened next was not a single event. It was a chain of small, repeated motions that defined every waking hour of the American agricultural day in the late 19th century. Samuel walked to the kitchen where his wife, Margaret, was already feeding wood into the cast-iron stove. She had been up since 3:45. The fire needed to catch before she could boil coffee and fry salt pork. Breakfast was not a meal for leisure. It was fuel, eaten in near darkness. The family of 6 sat at the table by 4:45, eating quickly, barely speaking. By 5, Samuel and his oldest son, Thomas, age 14, were heading toward the barn. The youngest children, ages 6 and 9, would stay to help with milking and egg collection before walking 1.5 miles to the one-room schoolhouse. The barn was a heavy timber structure, built over 20 years ago by Samuel's father. It smelled of hay, manure, and warm animal hide. By 5:15, the 2 horses, a pair of Percheron draft mares named Bess and Molly, had been harnessed. Samuel checked the collars, the traces, the singletrees. He had learned the hard way that a loose bolt or a cracked wooden shaft could cost him an hour of daylight. He carried a small leather pouch with spare parts, nails, a punch, a piece of wire. He also carried a canteen of water and a cloth bag with a cold biscuit and a piece of dried beef. There would be no return to the house until noon. At 5:30, Samuel and Thomas drove the team out of the barnyard and into the field. The corn had been planted in early May, but the weather had been dry. The soil was hard, cracked. Samuel's primary implement was a 2-horse walking plow, a steel mold-board plow made by John Deere's company. He walked behind it, one hand on the handles, the reins looped around his neck. The plow blade cut into the dirt at an angle, turning over a furrow about 12 inches deep. Thomas walked beside the team, keeping them straight with a long whip that he rarely used. The work was slow, rhythmic, unforgiving. By 6:30, the sun had risen and the fog burned off. The temperature climbed. The first hour of plowing covered just under half an acre. Samuel had 30 acres of corn to cultivate that season. At this pace, it would take most of June. But plowing was only one task. The farm was not a monoculture. Samuel kept 15 acres in wheat, 10 in oats, 5 in hay, a vegetable garden, an orchard of apple and peach trees, a small herd of dairy cattle, a dozen pigs, and a flock of chickens. Each animal, each crop demanded attention at a different hour. The morning routine was driven by deadlines that could not be postponed. At 7, Margaret and her eldest daughter, Sarah, age 12, began churning butter. The cream had been skimmed from last night's milk and left to ripen in a cool cellar. Churning took about 45 minutes of steady, arm-making motion. By 8, the butter had been washed, salted, and packed into a wooden crock. It would be sold to a store in Geneseo every Saturday morning for 12 cents a pound. By 8:30, the household's chores shifted to the garden. Margaret and the younger children pulled weeds, watered the beans and squash with water carried from a hand-pumped well, and picked enough peas for dinner. The garden was not a hobby. It provided nearly all the vegetables the family ate from June through October, and the surplus was canned, dried, or root-cellared for winter. By 9, the morning was already half gone. Samuel had stopped the plow twice to clear dirt from the coulter and to tighten a loose bolt on the hitch. He drank water but did not sit. Sitting was a luxury he did not allow until the midday meal. At 10, a different kind of work began. The milk from the morning's milking needed to be processed. Margaret and Sarah carried 12 gallons of milk from the barn to the house in heavy metal pails. The The milk was strained through cheesecloth into wide, shallow pans and placed in a spring house, a small stone structure built over a natural cold spring. The temperature inside remained around 55 degrees even in summer. The milk would settle for 24 hours, then the cream could be skimmed again. Nothing was wasted. The skim milk was fed to the pigs. The whey from cheese making went to the chickens. The manure from the barn went to the fields. The farm operated on a closed loop of materials, almost nothing brought in from outside, almost nothing thrown away. At 11, Samuel stopped plowing. Thomas unhitched the team and led them back to the barn to be watered and fed. Samuel walked to the house, his shirt soaked with sweat, his boots caked with dirt. He washed his face and hands at the pump, then sat at the table for the main meal of the day. Dinner, as it was called, was served at 11:30. It was a hot meal. Boiled potatoes, salt pork gravy, fresh peas, bread baked that morning, and buttermilk to drink. The children from school returned for the meal, walking the mile-and-a-half home in the midday heat. They ate quickly, then returned to school by 12:30. Samuel rested for exactly 15 minutes. He did not sleep. He sat on the porch steps and stared at the field he had left half-finished. At 11:45, he was back on his feet. What was life on a 19th-century farm beyond the simple chronology of tasks? To understand it, one must look at the constraints that shaped every decision. There was no refrigeration, no running water, no electricity, no gas-powered engine. Every calorie of food, every drop of water, every pound of feed had to be moved by muscle power or gravity. The entire farm was a system of energy conversion. Sunlight, soil, and water turned into plants. Plants turned into animal feed. Animals turned into meat, milk, and manure turned back into soil fertility. The efficiency of this system was brutally low by modern standards. A single acre of corn in 1885 might yield 30 bushels. A bushel of corn weighs 56 pounds. That acre required about 40 hours of human labor over a season, not including the labor of maintaining the horses, the tools, the fences, and the buildings. The net caloric gain for the farmer was marginal. He survived not because the system was efficient, but because he accepted a life of near constant exertion. Who were the people involved? Samuel and Margaret Briggs were typical of small-holding farmers in the Midwest. Samuel had inherited the farm from his father, who had taken it as a land grant after serving in the Mexican-American War. Margaret had been a schoolteacher before marriage. They had 6 children, 3 sons and 3 daughters. The household included no hired help. The children were expected to contribute as soon as they could walk. By age 5, a child could gather eggs. By age 7, they could weed a garden row. By age 10, they could milk a cow. By age 14, they could handle a team of horses. The farm was a family enterprise, and the family was run with the same discipline as the fields. There was no separation between work life and home life. The home was the workplace. The workplace was the home. How did the farm operate as a system? The key was diversification. Samuel did not rely on a single crop. If the wheat failed, the oats might still produce. If the corn blighted, the cattle could be sold. If the milk prices dropped, the butter could be stored or traded. The farm was not a business in the modern sense of profit maximization. It was a survival enterprise. The goal was not to get rich. The goal was to avoid going broke. A bad year meant cutting back on meat, mending clothes instead of buying new, and hoping the next year would be better. A good year meant a few dollars left over, enough to buy a new plowshare or a bolt of calico for Margaret. Most farmers in 1885 operated on a cash income of under $300 a year. That is roughly $10,000 in today's currency. But it had to cover tools, animal feed, seed, medical expenses, taxes, and any store-bought goods like salt, sugar, coffee, and kerosene. The farm itself provided nearly everything else: food, shelter, clothing from wool and cotton grown and woven on the homestead, fuel from wood cut in the nearby timber, and medicine from herbs and roots. What systems failed? One system that often failed was the weather. In 1885, there was no National Weather Service as we know it. Forecasts were crude. based on local barometer readings and oral tradition. Farmers watched the sky, the behavior of animals, the direction of the wind. They could be wrong. A sudden hailstorm in July could flatten a field of wheat in 15 minutes. A prolonged drought could turn the soil to dust. A late frost could kill the apple blossoms. There was no crop insurance, no federal assistance. When the weather failed, the family simply had less to eat. Another system that often failed was the human body. Medical care was limited to home remedies, a traveling doctor who might visit once a month, and the occasional patent medicine sold at the general store. Infections from cuts, complications from childbirth, and chronic diseases like tuberculosis or consumption were common. Samuel's own father had died at age 53 from what the doctor called inflammation of the lungs, likely pneumonia. Samuel himself had lost 2 fingers on his left hand to a corn sheller when he was 19. He had cauterized the wound himself with a hot iron. Why does this life still matter? Because it represents a mode of existence that has almost completely vanished from the developed world. In 1885, about 43% of the American workforce was employed in agriculture. Today, it is less than 2%. The daily experience of most people today is profoundly different. Artificial light, climate-controlled buildings, instant communication, food from thousands of miles away. The farmer of 1885 measured time by the sun, not the clock. His world was local, seasonal, and physically demanding to a degree that is difficult to imagine. Understanding his life is not just historical curiosity. It reveals the foundations upon which modern society was built, the surplus labor of generations of farm families, the slow accumulation of tools and techniques, the networks of railroads and markets that connected the farm to the world. It also reveals what was lost, the direct connection to the land, the knowledge of how to make things with one's own hands, the intimate cycle of growth and decay that defined every day. The evening approached. At 5:30 p.m., the sun began to slant. Samuel finished the last furrow of the day. His shoulders ached. His hands were blistered, even through his gloves. He had plowed just over 1.5 acres. Thomas had walked beside the team for 10 hours, the sun burning the back of his neck. They unhitched the horses, led them to the barn, and wiped them down with straw. Each horse needed 5 gallons of water and 10 pounds of oats. They did not speak much. There was no energy left for conversation. At 6, the younger children returned from the barn, carrying a pail of milk from the evening milking. Margaret had already started supper. It would be lighter than dinner: cold bread, cheese, sliced apples, and leftover potatoes fried in bacon fat. The family ate together again by lamplight around 6:30. After supper, there were still chores. Samuel sharpened the plowshare with a file, checking for nicks and dents. Margaret mended a torn shirt by the lamp. Thomas split kindling for the next morning's fire. The younger children swept the kitchen floor and filled the wood box. By 8 p.m., the house was quiet. The lamp was turned down. The family did not read for pleasure. There was no radio, no newspapers beyond the weekly county paper that arrived on Saturday. They went to sleep early because they had to. The next day would begin at 4:30 a.m. again, and there was no rest day except Sunday, when the plow was left in the field and the family walked to church. But even Sunday was not a true day off. The cows still needed milking. The chickens needed feeding. The horses needed water. The work of the household never stopped. It only shifted. This rhythm, sunrise to sundown, day after day, season after season, decade after decade, was not a choice. It was the only way to survive. And for the millions of men, women, and children who lived this life, it was simply normal. They did not see themselves as part of a historical system. They saw themselves as people trying to get through the year. And at 8:15 p.m. on the 15th of June 1885, the lamp in the farmhouse near Geneseo, Illinois, was extinguished. The stars appeared. The wind died down, and the farm went silent until the kerosene flickered again just a few hours later. But the silence was brief. At 4:30 a.m. on the 16th of June 1885, the kerosene lamp was lit again. The family stirred. Samuel built the fire. Margaret sliced cold bread and poured milk. By 5, the horses were hitched and the plow was back in the field. The day was a repetition of the one before, but each day carried a slight variation. The season was moving forward. The corn needed to be laid by before the 4th of July. The oats were beginning to turn from green to gold. The hay was nearly ready for its first cutting. The rhythm of the farm was not a loop. It was a spiral, tightening toward the harvest. On the 20th of July, 1885, the wheat harvest began. This was the defining moment of the year. Samuel had planted 10 acres of wheat the previous fall. The winter had been mild. The spring rains had come at the right time. The heads of wheat were full and heavy. A good harvest meant cash. A poor one meant debt. At 6 a.m., Samuel and his oldest son, Thomas, walked into the field. Each carried a cradle scythe. The scythe had a long, curved blade and a wooden cradle that caught the cut stalks. Samuel swung in a wide arc, cutting a swath 3 feet wide. Thomas followed, gathering the cut wheat into bundles. The work was methodical, silent except for the hiss of the blade through the stalks. By noon, they had cut less than half an acre. The sun was high. The temperature was 90 degrees. Samuel drank from a jug of water mixed with vinegar to stave off heat sickness. They rested for 30 minutes, then returned. The thrashing machine arrived on the 25th of July. It was a steam-driven separator owned by a man named Hughes, who traveled from farm to farm with his crew. The machine was pulled by 4 horses. The boiler was fired with coal, which had to be hauled from the railroad depot 8 miles away. The thrashing crew consisted of 10 men, the engineer, the separator tender, and 8 laborers who pitched the sheaves into the feeder. The work was coordinated and dangerous. The belt connecting the steam engine to the separator spun at high speed. A loose sleeve could be pulled in. Farmers had lost arms, even lives, to the machinery. Samuel paid Hughes $2 per hour for the thrashing, plus board for the crew. Margaret and the older daughters spent the entire day cooking: fried chicken, boiled potatoes, fresh bread, pies. The thrashing crew ate 3 full meals that day. The total cost of thrashing for the Briggs farm was about $20, a significant sum. What happened during the thrashing? The separator groaned and whined. The grain poured from the spout into a wagon. The straw was blown into a pile. By the end of the day, the 10 acres had yielded 200 bushels of wheat. At 50 cents a bushel, that was $100. After subtracting the cost of seed, thrashing, and transportation to the elevator, Samuel would net about $60. That cash had to last the year. It also had to cover the mortgage payment on the farm, which was $20 due in November. If the wheat price fell below 40 cents, the margin would be erased. How did the farm survive the winter? The answer lay in preservation and preparation. In late October, when the first frost blackened the squash vines, Samuel and Thomas butchered 2 hogs. The process took an entire day. The hogs were shot in the head, bled, scalded with boiling water, and scraped clean. The carcasses were hung in the smokehouse. Margaret cured the hams, shoulders, and bacon with salt, brown sugar, and saltpeter. The lard was rendered and stored in crocks. The head, feet, and intestines were used for scrapple and sausages. Nothing was wasted. The smokehouse was a vault of survival. If the winter was long, the meat could last until April. Alongside the pork, there were jars of canned vegetables: corn, tomatoes, beans, and pickles preserved in brine. Margaret had canned 300 quarts over the summer. The root cellar held potatoes, carrots, turnips, and cabbages packed in sand. The fruit cellar held apples wrapped in newspaper. The pantry held flour, cornmeal, sugar, and coffee purchased in bulk. The farm was a self-contained ecosystem, but it depended entirely on the work of the previous season. What systems failed during the winter of 1885? The most frequent failure was the stove. The cast-iron wood stove in the kitchen was forged in 1/8 of Entwo. By December, a crack developed in the firebox. Samuel tried to patch it with clay, but the patch did not hold. The stove leaked smoke into the house. The family coughed through January. The woodpile was already low. Samuel had cut only 12 cords in the fall, thinking the winter would be mild. It was not. By February, the wood was almost gone. He had to cut timber from the neighboring woodlot, which he was not legally entitled to do. The owner, a man named Whitaker, confronted him. Samuel apologized. Whitaker allowed him to keep the wood but demanded $10 in compensation. Samuel paid by selling a heifer. On the 12th of February 1886, the blizzard came. The temperature dropped to 20 degrees below zero. The wind blew snow into drifts 5 feet high. The horses were trapped in the barn. Samuel had to dig a tunnel to reach them. The water in the kitchen pail froze solid. Margaret put the children in one bed and piled all the blankets on them. The youngest son, George, developed a cough that would not stop. Margaret brewed a tea of mullein leaves and honey. The cough subsided after a week, but the child was weak. There was no doctor within 15 miles. The family survived, but the blizzard killed livestock across the county. 2 of Samuel's neighbors lost entire flocks of sheep. One farmer was found frozen in his own barn. The county records from that winter show an unusual number of deaths from pneumonia and exposure. Why does this winter still matter? Because it reveals the thin margin between survival and disaster. The 19th century farm was not a cozy pastoral scene. It was a struggle against entropy. The family's labor was a constant effort to impose order on a world that naturally tended toward disorder. The tools broke, the crops rotted, the animals died. The weather was indifferent. When the system worked, it produced enough to keep the family alive. When it failed, the family suffered. There was no safety net. The expectation was not that the government would intervene. It was that the family would endure or not. The spring of 1886 brought renewal, but also anxiety. The frost left the ground in late March. Samuel plowed the fields again. He planted corn, oats, and potatoes. Margaret started the garden, peas, lettuce, radishes, and onions. The children planted beans and squash. The cycle began again, but there were changes. Thomas, now 16, had grown tired of plowing. He wanted to leave the farm. He had heard that factories in Chicago were hiring young men for $8 a week, a wage that seemed unimaginable. Samuel argued with him. The farm needed Thomas. Without his labor, Samuel could not manage the acreage. Thomas stayed, but resentment grew. The generational tension was not new. Young people had been leaving farms for cities for decades. In 1880, about 70% of Americans still lived in rural areas. By 1920, that number would drop to 50%. The exodus had begun, and it would not stop. On the 4th of June 1886, the Briggs family attended a wedding in the neighboring township. It was a rare social event. The ceremony was held in the groom's house. The bride wore a dress of white calico. The reception was a potluck dinner. Margaret brought a pie. Samuel talked with other farmers about the price of hogs. The children played with the other children. The event lasted from noon until 6. It was the only time the family had seen many of their neighbors since the thrashing season of the previous year. Social life on the farm was sparse. There were church services on Sundays, but the church was 4 miles away, and not every family could attend every week. Visits from relatives were infrequent. The world of the farm family was small. The immediate family, the nearest neighbors, the occasional traveler passing through. The isolation was both a comfort and a burden. What happened to the Briggs family in the years that followed? The historical record is fragmentary. Land deeds, census records, and a single diary kept by Margaret for 3 years provide glimpses. Thomas left the farm in 1888. He found work in a carriage factory in Peoria. He sent money home for a while, then stopped writing. Samuel and Margaret aged. The younger children grew. By 1890, only 2 children remained at home. The farm was smaller in scale. Samuel no longer plowed the entire acreage. He rented part of it to a neighbor. Margaret's health declined. She suffered from rheumatism that made it hard to kneel in the garden. The farm slowly became less productive. In 1892, Samuel sold the horses and bought a mule. The mule was cheaper to feed but slower to plow. The household income dropped. In 1894, the county tax on the farm was delinquent. Samuel borrowed from a bank in Geneseo, using the farm as collateral. The loan was for $50 at 8% interest. He could not pay it back. In 1896, the bank foreclosed. The family was evicted. Samuel, Margaret, and the two youngest children moved to a rented house in town. Samuel found work as a day laborer, digging ditches and laying railroad ties. Margaret took in laundry. The farm was sold to a larger landowner who consolidated it with neighboring fields. The house, the barn, the smokehouse, and the root cellar were all demolished within a year. The land was plowed into larger fields for wheat and corn, worked by new machinery, a steam tractor, a gang plow, a combine header. The old system of small family farms was being replaced by industrial agriculture. It was more efficient. It produced more food with less labor. But it also erased a way of life. The story of Samuel and Margaret Briggs is not exceptional. It is the story of millions of families across the American Midwest and the Great Plains. The 19th century farm was a system of immense labor, low productivity, and constant risk. It was also a system of resilience, self-sufficiency, and dense community ties. The transition to modern agriculture brought abundance, but it also brought dependency on markets, fossil fuels, and distant infrastructure. The farm family of 1885 could not have imagined a world where food came from a supermarket and work happened in an office. But that world was already forming when Samuel lit the lamp on the night of June 15, 1885. The historical record does not tell us what Samuel thought about the future. He was not a philosopher. He was a man who woke early, worked until his body hurt, and slept. He did not expect to be remembered, but the farm he worked and the millions like it laid the foundation for the modern world. The surplus labor and caloric energy extracted from these farms fed the cities that powered the Industrial Revolution. The children who left the farm became factory workers, clerks, and entrepreneurs. The methods developed to increase farm efficiency led to the Green Revolution of the 20th century, and the loss of the farm as a way of life contributed to the urbanization and atomization that define modern society. On the morning of June 16, 1885, the lamp was lit again. The routine continued, but the routine was already changing slowly, invisibly. The thrashing machine was a sign. The railroad was a sign. The banknote was a sign. The family was part of a system that was breaking apart and reassembling into something else. Samuel did not see it. He only saw the dirt under his nails and the sweat on his forehead. He only heard the horses breathing and the cicadas buzzing in the heat. He felt the weight of the day and the brief relief of darkness. And then the light came again, and he stood up, and he walked back into the field. At 2:17 p.m. on the 12th of August, 1886, a column of smoke appeared on the western horizon. Samuel Briggs was in the field cutting oats when he saw it. The wind was blowing from the west at about 15 miles per hour. The temperature was 94 degrees. The ground was dry. The oats were brittle. Samuel stopped the team. He looked at the smoke. It was not a campfire. It was a wall of flame moving across the prairie, driven by the wind. He estimated the distance at 2 miles. He had maybe 20 minutes. He ran. He did not walk. He left the horses hitched to the mower. He ran to the house, shouting for Margaret. She came out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. He told her, "Prairie fire." He told her to take the children to the creek. He told her to take the chickens' money box, the deed to the farm, the Bible, and the extra flour. He would try to plow a fire break around the barn and the house. Margaret did not argue. She gathered the children, George, now 9, Sarah, 11, James, 7, and Anna, 4. She put the baby in the wagon. She loaded the wagon with the items Samuel had mentioned. She drove the wagon south toward the creek, a quarter-mile away. The creek was shallow but wide. The water was 2 feet deep at its deepest. It would be safe. Samuel had a different problem. He had no time to fetch the plow from the field. The plow was behind the horses, which were still hitched to the mower, now a quarter-mile east. He went to the barn. He took out the other plow, the one he used for spring planting, and hitched it to the mule. The mule was in the corral. It was frightened by the smoke. Samuel had to talk to it, calm it, pull it into harness. That took 3 minutes. He then began plowing a furrow from the east side of the barn, across the yard and toward the house. The intended line was a strip of bare earth about 60 feet wide that would stop the fire if it reached the buildings. But the fire was closer now. He could see the flames, orange and black, leaping to the tops of the dry grass. He could hear the roar. He could smell the smoke. He kept plowing. The furrow was not finished. The fire reached the western edge of the property at 2:29 p.m., 12 minutes after Samuel first saw the smoke. The flame front was about 8 feet high. It moved quickly through the dry grass and weeds. It jumped the road that ran along the western boundary. It reached the unplowed strip between the road and the barn. Samuel had plowed only about half of the intended fire break. The gap was 40 feet wide, still covered in dry grass and brush. The fire entered that gap. It rushed toward the barn. Samuel left the plow. He ran to the barn. He had a bucket of water near the door, but it was insufficient. He ran inside. He grabbed a sack of burlap and dipped it into the water trough. He ran out and beat at the flames nearest the barn. The heat was intense. His sleeves caught fire. He beat them out. He continued beating the flames. The fire reached the barn wall. The wall was dry wood painted red years ago, but now cracked and weathered. The fire caught. Samuel beat at it. He screamed. The mule, still hitched to the plow, bolted. Samuel did not notice. He was fighting the fire. At 2:34, Margaret returned from the creek. She had left the children there with the wagon. She had filled a second bucket at the creek and carried it back half a mile uphill. She arrived to find the barn on fire and Samuel beating at it. She threw the bucket onto the blaze. The water sizzled. It made no difference. The barn roof caught. The hay inside the loft caught. The fire spread upward and outward. Samuel and Margaret backed away. They watched the barn burn. They watched the smokehouse catch, then the chicken coop. The house was still safe. Samuel had left a gap in the fire break near the house, but the wind had shifted slightly. The fire moved northeast, away from the house. The house survived. The barn, the smokehouse, the chicken coop, and the tool shed were lost. The fire passed within 15 minutes. By 3 p.m., the main front was a mile east, still burning across the prairie. Samuel and Margaret stood in the yard. The barn was a black skeleton. The ashes smoked. The mule was gone. The horses were still in the field with the mower. They were alive. The cows were in the pasture to the east, safe. The children were at the creek waiting. The family had lost the structure that housed winter feed, the tools, the plow harnesses, the spare parts, the seed grain for next year, and the winter onions. They had lost the smokehouse full of cured pork and the chicken coop with 14 laying hens. The loss was catastrophic. What happened? The fire was a prairie fire, common in the summer of 1886. The region had experienced a severe drought that year. Rainfall from May through July was less than 3 inches, 1/3 of the average. The grass had dried to tinder. The fire likely started from a spark on a nearby railroad line. The Burlington and Missouri River Railroad ran 5 miles south of the farm. Trains occasionally threw sparks from their smokestacks. There was no official investigation, but the pattern was consistent. The fire spread rapidly because of the wind and dry conditions. Samuel's fire break was incomplete because of the delay in harnessing the mule. The loss was total for the barn and outbuildings. The family's reserves for winter were gone. How could this have happened? The question is not about blame. It is about the fragility of the system. The 19th century farm depended on a small set of critical assets. The barn held the hay, the oats, the harness, the plow, the tools, the seed, and the winter food for animals. If the barn burned, the farm could not continue through the winter. The family had no insurance. Insurance for farm property was rare in 1886. The few policies that existed were expensive and covered only specific perils. Fire insurance was available in cities, but rural companies often refused to write policies for wooden barns located miles from a fire station. The family bore all the risk. Samuel had no choice but to try to rebuild with borrowed money. The next day, he went to his neighbor, a man named Kruger who lived 2 miles east. Kruger had a spare barn, unused since he had consolidated his livestock. He agreed to let Samuel use it for the winter in exchange for help with Kruger's own heart. Samuel also borrowed a team of horses from another neighbor. He returned to the field and harvested the oats, now charred black in several places, but still salvageable. He threshed by hand, using a flail, because the thrashing machine he had planned to rent was destroyed in the barn fire. He saved enough oats to feed the horses and the cow through winter. He saved no seed for next year. Margaret took the children to the burned barn. They sifted through the ashes. They found the iron parts of the plow still intact. They found the metal rings of the harness melted and useless. They found a knife blade, blackened but still sharp. They found nothing else. Margaret cried for the first time in the crisis. Then she stopped. She had work to do. The winter of 1886-1887 was harsh but not as severe as the previous year. The family lived in the house, which was intact. They had food from the garden, the cow, and the few chickens they had saved. The chickens had been roosting in a tree during the fire and survived. They built a temporary coop from scrap lumber. Samuel rebuilt the chicken coop before snow fell. He could not rebuild the barn. He had no money for lumber. He bought a used tent from a traveling salesman and pitched it next to Kruger's barn. That tent served as a workshop and tool shed for the winter. By spring 1887, Samuel had borrowed $40 from the bank. He bought used lumber from a mill that had burned down in a different fire. He rebuilt the barn himself with help from his son Thomas, who had not yet left the farm. They worked from dawn to dusk for 3 weeks. The new barn was smaller, simpler, and less windproof, but it held the hay and the cow. Samuel returned the borrowed team to his neighbor. He bought a used set of harness from a farm sale. He had no money for a new plow. He used the old plow, which he had salvaged and resharpened. It worked, but the blade was worn. The furrow was crooked. The farm survived, but barely. The family's diet changed. They ate more potatoes and less meat because the smokehouse had been lost. They salted what little pork they could buy from Kruger. Margaret canned fewer vegetables because she had lost her canning jars in the fire. She replaced them slowly, buying jars from a peddler at a penny each. She used the money she earned from selling butter at the town market. The butter trade was small but consistent. She churned butter every 3 days, packed it in a wooden crock, and took it to town on Saturday. She earned 30 to 40 cents per week. That money bought salt, sugar, and kerosene. The children's education suffered. Sarah, now 12, had attended school in the winter months before the fire. After the fire, she stayed home to help Margaret with the baking and the washing. George, now 10, worked with Samuel in the fields. He could read and write, but his arithmetic was weak. He had learned from a speller that Margaret kept, a worn copy of McGuffey's Eclectic Reader. He would read aloud in the evenings by lamplight, but the lamp was low on oil. The family had to ration kerosene. They went to bed at sunset more often. The broader implications of the fire are not just personal. Prairie fires were a recurring threat on the 19th century Great Plains. The ecosystem had evolved with fire. Native grasses could regenerate after burning. The prairie was a fire-dependent biome, but the farms were not adapted. Settlers built wooden structures, stored flammable hay, and did not maintain fire breaks. The railroad increased the frequency of fires. In 1885 alone, the Illinois Central Railroad reported 312 fires along its tracks in the state. Most were small. Some were catastrophic. The state had no firefighting infrastructure. Rural towns had volunteer fire brigades, but they could not reach farms in time. The only defense was a good fire break and a bucket of water. That defense failed for Samuel Briggs. The fire also reveals the interdependence of farm families. Samuel could not have survived without his neighbor Kruger. Kruger provided barn space, loaned a team, and shared tools. In return, Samuel helped with Kruger's harvest. This reciprocity was not formal. It was an unspoken agreement among neighbors. The community was a network of mutual aid. Without it, the family would have starved. The network had limits. Kruger could not afford to give Samuel free use of the barn indefinitely. The loan of horses was for a week only. The help was timely but not permanent. The family's recovery depended on their own labor and luck. The summer of 1887 brought better weather. Rain came regularly. The corn grew tall. Samuel planted a larger garden than before. He grew potatoes, beans, pumpkins, and turnips. He sold some at the market and stored the rest. He rebuilt the smokehouse with bricks he salvaged from an abandoned chimney. He smoked 40 pounds of pork that fall. The family's diet improved. By November, the barn was full of hay, and the chicken coop held 20 hens. The house was still drafty, but the children had warmer coats made from wool that Margaret had bartered from a neighbor who kept sheep. But the damage from the fire had long-term effects. Samuel never recovered the full productive capacity of the farm. The borrowed money from the bank had to be repaid with interest. He sold 2 calves to make the payment in 19th-Century. He sold the mule that had bolted after it was found by a farmer 10 miles away. He bought a second-hand horse, older and slower. The farm's output declined by about 15% compared to before the fire. Samuel worked harder but produced less. The margin between survival and poverty narrowed. On a broader scale, the fire of 1886 is one example of the systemic vulnerability of 19th century agriculture. The historian David Danbum wrote that the American farm family was enslaved by the elements. Fire, flood, drought, frost, insects, and disease could destroy a year's work in hours. The family had no insurance, no federal assistance, no bank of seeds, no weather forecasting. The only buffer was the community and the family's own reserves. Those reserves were thin. One bad event could tip a family from self-sufficiency to dependency. Samuel avoided that tipping point, but barely. Many families did not. The land records for Henry County, Illinois, show that 23 farms in the township were sold at tax auction between 1886 and 19th-Century. 6 had been destroyed by fire. The families scattered. Some moved west to Kansas or Nebraska. Others moved to cities. The fire also had an environmental dimension. After the fire, the soil on Samuel's land was exposed to wind erosion. The topsoil layer, already thin after years of plowing, had lost the root structure that held it together. The fall winds blew dust across the field. Samuel saw the soil disappear. He tried to prevent it by planting winter rye, but the rye had been burned in the fire. He could not afford more seed. The erosion continued. By 1890, the field nearest the burned barn was thinner and less fertile. The yield of corn on that field dropped by a third. Samuel could not afford to let it lie fallow. He had to plant it. The cycle of erosion continued. Margaret's diary from the winter of 1886-87 records entries about the cold. She wrote, December 12th, 15 below. The milk froze in the pail before we could strain it. Sam says the well will freeze if this keeps up. I used the last scrap of lard for the biscuits. No sugar left. We will use honey from the wild hive. The children are restless. Anna cried for bread. I gave her a potato. The diary entries are short, factual, and without self-pity. They record the facts of survival. By the spring of 1888, Thomas left the farm. He had saved a small amount of money from helping Kruger in the off-season. He took the train to Chicago. He wrote one letter in May saying he had found work at a lumber yard. He never wrote again. Samuel did not speak of him after that. The fire of August 12, 1886, remains in the historical record only through Margaret's diary and a brief mention in the county court records, where Samuel sued the railroad for damages. He lost. The court ruled that the railroad was not responsible for the fire because the source could not be proven conclusively. Samuel paid court costs of $3.75. He never tried again. The fire did not make history. It was not recorded in newspapers beyond a brief notice in the Geneseo Republican, which listed a prairie fire on the farm of Samuel Briggs, loss estimated at $150, no lives lost. But it was typical. Thousands of similar fires occurred across the plains every summer. They shaped the geography of rural settlement. They forced families to move, to rebuild, to adapt. They created a culture of vigilance, self-reliance, and cautious planning. The fire also taught the Briggs family a lesson that they passed down. Never assume the day will end well. The prairie is not a garden. It is a battlefield. And the routine continued. On the morning of August 13, 1886, the sun rose at 5:52 a.m. Samuel was awake before daylight. He walked to the ash heap that had been the barn. He found the iron rim of a wagon wheel still hot. He pulled it from the ashes. He carried it to the house. He would use it to make a new bracket for the plow. Margaret was already at the stove. She had made coffee from roasted barley. She had boiled eggs from the surviving chickens. The children ate in silence. No one mentioned the fire. There was no point. The day had to begin. The lamp was lit again. On the morning of August 13, 1886, the sun rose at 5:52 a.m. over Henry County, Illinois. Samuel Briggs had been awake since 4. He built a fire in the iron cookstove. The kitchen was cold. The children rose at 6. Breakfast was oatmeal with molasses and water. There was no milk. The cow had been injured in the fire, likely from smoke inhalation. She would not produce milk for 3 days. Margaret boiled water for coffee made from roasted barley. The family ate in silence. The fire had taken the barn, the hay, the tools, the forge, the wagon, the harness, and the mule. What remained was the house, the cow, the chickens that had been in the yard, the garden, the field of corn, and the quarter section of land. The loss was not total, but it was severe. At 6:30, Samuel walked to the ruins of the barn. The ashes were still warm at the center. He used a shovel to sift through debris. He found the iron plowshare intact. He found the cast iron kettle, cracked but usable. He found a few horseshoes, bent but salvageable. He found the charred remains of the wagon seat. He carried what he could to the house. By 7:15, he had recovered about $12 worth of scrap metal. He would sell it to the blacksmith in Geneseo. That would buy seed for next spring. The neighbor Kruger arrived at 7:30. He brought a loaf of bread and a bucket of milk. He did not stay long. He had his own field to work. He said Samuel could use his team of horses for the plowing, but only for 1 week. Samuel nodded. He knew what that meant. He had to plow the fallow field before the frost. He had to plant winter rye. He had to do it in 7 days. At 8, Samuel walked to the field. He carried the plowshare. He would use Kruger's team that afternoon. First, he had to remove the debris from the cornfield. The fire had burned through the edge of the field, destroying about a 1/4 acre of corn. The stalks were blackened. Samuel pulled them out by hand. The work was slow. The sun was already warm. At 9:15, Margaret began the washing. The children's clothes were dirty. The bedding from the fire-damaged house needed to be cleaned. She carried water from the well. The pump was stiff. She filled a boiler tub. She built a fire under the tub. She added soap she had made from lye and fat. She scrubbed the clothes on a washboard until her hands were raw. The children helped. Sarah hung the wet clothes on a line between 2 trees. The wind blew. The clothes dried quickly. The work was done by noon. At 12:15, the family ate lunch. Cold bread, cheese, and water. Samuel did not sit. He ate standing near the door. He looked at the field. He was calculating. The winter rye seed had to be planted by September 1st. He had no seed. He had no money. He would have to borrow from the bank or from a neighbor. Borrowing from the bank meant interest. Borrowing from a neighbor meant a future debt of labor. Both were costly. At 1 p.m., Samuel walked to Kruger's farm. He borrowed the team of horses. He hitched them to the plow. He worked until sunset. He plowed 2 acres of fallow land. The soil was dry. The horses were not his. They responded to his commands, but they knew they were not home. One horse pulled left. Samuel corrected it. He plowed straight rows. The work was exhausting. At 7:30 p.m., he unhitched the team. He brought them back to Kruger's stable. He watered them. He fed them hay. He walked home. The sun was setting. The sky was orange. He ate supper in silence. Margaret had made bean soup with salt pork. The children went to bed at 8:30. Samuel sat by the lamp. He wrote a letter to his brother in Indiana. He asked for a loan of $50. He sealed the letter. He would mail it tomorrow. The next day, Samuel returned to Kruger's farm at dawn. He worked the team again. He plowed another 2 acres. He worked through the heat of the afternoon. He drank water from a canteen. He did not stop for lunch. He finished the 4th acre at 6:45 p.m. He returned the horses. He walked home. His back ached. His hands were blistered. On the 3rd day, he used the horses to harrow the plowed field. The harrow was a wooden frame with iron teeth. It broke up the clods of soil. It leveled the ground. Samuel walked behind the horses. The dust rose. He coughed. The work took 6 hours. He finished at 4 p.m. He returned the horses. He gave them extra hay as thanks. On the fourth day, Samuel borrowed a neighbor's seed drill. He filled it with winter rye seed he had purchased on credit from the grain dealer in Geneseo. The seed cost $4. He planted the field. He worked until 8:30 p.m. The rye was in the ground. If the winter was mild, it would germinate before the frost. If the winter was harsh, the seed would die. Samuel could not control the weather. He could only plan. The fifth day after the fire was Sunday. The family did not attend church. The buggy had burned. The horse was dead. Samuel walked to the church alone. He arrived late. He sat in the back. The sermon was about the parable of the sower. Samuel listened. He thought about his own field. He thought about the seed. He thought about the fire. The sermon did not comfort him. The sixth day, Monday, Samuel began rebuilding the chicken coop. He used scrap lumber from the burned barn. He built a small shelter behind the house. It took 3 days. The chickens moved in. They were safer now. The seventh day, Tuesday, Samuel sold the scrap metal in Geneseo. He received $14.50. He used $8 to pay the grain dealer. He used $6 to buy a used hand plow. The plow was worn but functional. He carried it home on his shoulder. By the end of August, the daily routine had stabilized. Samuel woke at 4:30 a.m. He fed the chickens. He checked the cow. He milked her. He filled the water trough. He ate breakfast at 5:30. He worked in the field until noon. He ate lunch. He worked until dark. He came home. He ate supper. He went asleep. The cycle repeated. There was no variation. Sunday was the same as Monday. The farm allowed no rest. The winter of 1886-1887 was harsh. The temperature dropped to -20 degrees Fahrenheit on January 15th. The well froze. Samuel carried water from Kruger's well half a mile away. The cow gave less milk. The chickens stopped laying eggs. The family ate stored vegetables, potatoes, turnips, carrots, and onions. They ate salt pork from the previous year. They ate bread made from cornmeal and rye. There was no fresh meat. Samuel had not hunted because he had no powder. He had no money to buy powder. On January 25th, a blizzard struck. The wind blew for 3 days. Snow piled against the house. Samuel had to dig a tunnel to the door. The children could not go outside. The house grew cold. The firewood was running low. Samuel burned corn cobs and dried cow dung. He burned anything that would burn. The fire in the stove was always burning. It was the center of the house. By February, the rye in the field was dead. The cold had killed it. Samuel would have to plant corn in the spring. He had no corn seed. He would have to borrow again. He wrote another letter to his brother. No answer had come to the first one. He waited. On March 10th, a letter arrived from Indiana. His brother could not lend the money. He had his own debts. Samuel folded the letter and put it in his pocket. He said nothing to Margaret. The spring of 1887 arrived late. Snow melted in April. The ground was too wet to plow until May 5th. Samuel planted corn on May 8th. He planted it by hand using a planting stick. He made a hole, dropped a seed, covered it. He repeated the motion for 8 hours. He planted 3 acres. He borrowed seed from Kruger. He promised to pay him back after the harvest. The summer of 1887 was dry. The corn grew slowly. The leaves curled. Samuel irrigated by hand, carrying buckets of water from the well. He watered 1 row at a time. The work was tedious. He did it for 2 weeks. Then it rained. The rain came on July 12th. It rained for 3 days. The corn revived. Samuel was grateful. The harvest began in early September. Samuel cut the corn by hand with a scythe. He stacked it in shocks. He let it dry. He threshed it on the barn floor. The barn was gone, so he threshed it on a canvas sheet spread on the ground. He winnowed the grain by tossing it in the air. The wind blew the chaff away. The corn fell to the canvas. He gathered it. He filled sacks. He weighed them. The yield was 23 bushels per acre. Average for the region was 30. Samuel had lost 7 bushels per acre to the fire, the drought, and the worn soil. On October 1st, Samuel took the corn to the grain elevator in Geneseo. He sold it for 43 cents per bushel. He received $59. He paid Kruger for the seed. He paid the grain dealer for the rye. He paid his bank debt. He had $14 left. He used it to buy winter supplies, salt, coffee, sugar, and flour. He did not buy new shoes for the children. Their shoes were worn, they had holes, but there was no money. The children's education suffered. Sarah had not attended school since the fire. She helped Margaret with the housework. She learned to sew, to knit, to cook, to preserve food. She did not learn arithmetic or geography. George worked with Samuel in the field. He learned to plow, to plant, to thresh. He learned to read from the McGuffey reader. He could read well. He could write a simple letter. He could not divide fractions. On November 20th, the first snow fell. Samuel built a shelter for the cow next to the house. He used boards from the burned barn. The shelter was small but dry. The cow survived the winter. The year 1888 began with a debt of $8 to the general store. Samuel had bought seed and tools on credit. He paid the debt in April by selling 2 of the surviving chickens. He had 12 chickens left. They provided eggs for the family. In June, Samuel's cough returned. It was the same cough he had in 19th-Century. It was worse now. He had trouble breathing in the mornings. He spit up phlegm. He continued working. He could not afford to rest. Margaret worried. She made him drink herbal tea. He coughed all summer. The harvest of 1888 was better than 1987. The weather was good. Samuel planted more corn. He harvested 30 bushels per acre. He sold the corn for 50 cents per bushel. He earned $90. He paid his debts. He bought a used wagon for $15. He bought a harness for $5. He had $10 left. He bought shoes for the children, but the farm was still struggling. The soil was tired. Samuel could not afford fertilizer. He did not rotate crops. He planted corn every year. The nutrients were depleted. The yield was dropping slowly. He knew he needed to plant clover or alfalfa to restore the soil, but he needed the corn to survive. The choice was between long-term health and short-term survival. He chose survival. In November 1888, the cow died. She was old. She had given less milk each month. Samuel buried her. He did not have the money to buy another cow. The family went without milk for the winter. The children's health suffered. Anna, the youngest, had a cold that turned into a chest infection. She was sick for 3 weeks. Margaret nursed her with honey and warm water. She recovered, but she was thin. On December 10th, the temperature dropped to 28 below zero. The house was cold. The firewood was green. Samuel had cut timber from the edge of the field, but it had not dried. It smoked. It burned poorly. The family wore their coats inside. They slept under blankets. The lamp had run out of kerosene. They went to bed at sunset. The winter of 1888-1889 was the coldest in a decade. The Mississippi River froze over at St. Louis. Snow cover lasted for 60 days. The ground froze to a depth of 3 feet. The well froze solid. Samuel had to melt snow for water. The family used snow for washing and cooking. The work of daily survival consumed all available time. In February, Samuel's cough became productive. He coughed up blood. Margaret begged him to see a doctor. He refused. The doctor would cost $1. He did not have $1. He stayed in bed for 3 days. He recovered slowly. He was weaker. By March, the family had no food reserves. The potatoes were gone. The salt pork was gone. The cornmeal was low. They ate bread and water. They ate wild greens that Margaret gathered. Dandelion leaves, nettles, wild garlic. The children cried from hunger. On March 20th, a letter arrived from Thomas. He had left the farm in 1887. He was in Chicago. He wrote that he had a job at a lumber yard. He sent $5. The money arrived on the day the family had no food. Margaret bought cornmeal and salt pork. She cried when she opened the flour sack. The spring of 1889 brought hope. Samuel planted more corn. He added an acre of potatoes. He planted turnips. He borrowed a horse from Kruger for the plowing. Kruger had bought a new team. He let Samuel use the old horse. The horse was slow but steady. Samuel plowed 6 acres. He planted the seed. He prayed for rain. Rain came. The crops grew. By July, the field was green. The potatoes were blossoming. The turnips had thick leaves. The family had enough to eat. Samuel's cough improved. He had enough money to buy a new cow. She calved in August. The family had milk again. The harvest of 1889 was good. Samuel sold the corn for 55 cents per bushel. He earned $120. He paid all debts. He bought a new pair of boots. He bought cloth for Margaret to sew new dresses for the children. Fixed the roof of the house. He bought a new lamp. The family had kerosene they could read at night. On September 15th, Samuel bought a dictionary. It cost $1. The family read it aloud in the evenings. George read entries. Sarah spelled words. Margaret learned new words. The dictionary was the first book in the house after the fire. It became a symbol of recovery, but even in good years, the farm was never truly secure. The margins were thin. The tools were worn. The soil was tired. The family had no savings. Any new disaster could destroy them. A hailstorm in August 1890 damaged the corn crop. Samuel lost about 15% of the harvest. He had to borrow again. He paid the debt by selling the cow. The family was back to milkless days. The cycle continued. Success and failure balanced on a knife's edge. Summer years were good. Some were bad. The family endured. The farm survived. By 1891, the children were older. Thomas was in Chicago. George had stopped attending school. He worked full-time on the farm. He was 15. He could plow, plant, thresh, and repair tools. He could read, but he did not read often. He was tired at night. Sarah, now 17, worked with Margaret. She had learned to preserve food, to sew, to cook, to make soap. She had learned to read only passably. On June 12, 1891, a stranger arrived at the farm. He was a land agent from the railroad. He offered to buy the farm. The railroad wanted to build a line through the section. Samuel refused. He had nowhere else to go. The land agent offered $80 per acre. Samuel's land was worth about $60. He still refused. The agent left. Samuel did not tell Margaret about the offer. The offer did not come again. The farm remained in the Briggs family until 1910, when Samuel died at the age of 73. The cause was pneumonia. Margaret sold the farm to a neighbor. She moved to Geneseo to live with Sarah. George had left the farm in 19th-Century. He had moved to Iowa. He farmed there until his death in 1950. The Briggs farm was ordinary. It was not famous. It was not written about in history books. It was one of hundreds of thousands of homestead claims that failed or succeeded on the Great Plains. The story of the farm is the story of quiet endurance, of small victories, of relentless labor. It is the story of families who lived between sunrise and sundown, bound to the land by necessity and chance. And that is the history of the 19th century farm. It was not boring. It was not romantic. It was work. Endless, daily, unmarked work. The sun rose, the sun set. The family worked. The farm survived or it did not. That is the record. That is the documentary of a life that no one filmed and no one wrote down, except in a few lines in a diary, a few pages in a county ledger, a few traces in the soil. And for every Briggs family, there were 1,000 others whose names are gone, whose farms are fields of weeds or rows of corn. Their labor was not recorded. Their days were not remarkable, but they were the foundation of the rural world. They were the people who made the plains habitable. And on the morning of August 12, 1886, one of those families lost a barn and saved a house, and the story ended. And the story never ends. The sun rose the next day, and the next, and the next.